here from Department of City and Regional Planning at Berkeley. Is truly one of those scholars in planning who needs no introduction. And I'll charge ahead and provide her with an introduction anyways, but know that this is really, in her case, quite unnecessary. Judy is absolutely one of the leading lights in planning theory and one of a very small group of people who developed our current ideas around communicative planning and then collaboration. And if any of you students or faculty members are asked to name the top 3 people in collaborative theory within planning, there is no question that each of you would include the name Judith Innes among them. So we're thrilled to have her here. She holds her PhD from MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, was on faculty at Berkeley's Department of City and Regional Planning from 1975 to 2011, and now is emeritus. For 10 years, she directed the Institute of Urban and Regional Development. But all of that is the fairly functionary stuff. What she has really done is she has shaped our thinking about how agencies communicate and interact, and we're pleased to have her here to talk about that in the context of regional sustainability. So, Judy, what is that?
Thank you for that somewhat excessive introduction, but I appreciate it nonetheless. I also want to say that I really appreciate being invited to this, to your great institution, and to be able to talk to you about some of the ideas we've been working on. I even brought a copy of our book, my book with David Boer, who's over there, if anybody wants to glance through it, because some of the ideas kind of merged from that book as well. The topic for today is network planning for regional sustainability. And we're going to be focusing on some. How many of you ever heard of collaborative regional initiatives? Oh, a few of you have. There are quite a few in the LA area. This is based on a paper written by myself and Jane Rongerud, who's at Iowa State. It was also based on research done by myself, Annalise Saxenian, and my department, and Karen Christensen, as well as Gerardo Sandoval, who's now at Oregon. A bunch of other people, an army of people, helped us with this. So it originally started as an evaluation. The James Irvine Foundation asked us to do a study of these initiatives and tell us what they had accomplished, which we did, but that we've then tried to get it, so it's both theory and practice now. And we do believe that networks are what every planner has to be able to work with in the future. And we also think the planning literature needs a lot more work on those networks and needs a lot more understanding of what planners can and should do in these, that things are going to have to be done this way. Okay, I think I'll use this thing. All right. So let me start with the argument about the relationship of networks to regional sustainability. First, we are going to be using complexity theory. How many of you have any familiarity with complexity theory? I see some posters out on the wall there that look like complexity theory type maps, so take a look at those. Anyway, David Boer and I have developed this idea originally of metropolitan regions being looked at as self-organizing systems in the spirit of complexity theory. Self-organizing complex systems, which means they're capable of adapting in various ways. Now, why do we say this? First of all, this is a graphic from Peter Allen's book. He's one of the pioneers of looking at complexity in relation to metropolitan regions. And as you can see, some of you may be familiar with the Christaller central place theory diagram. If you look at it, it's completely static. It's fine. It might describe a region at a point in time, but he says, you know, wait a minute, it changes, and that theory has no room for change. It can't figure out anything about change. So he argues complexity theory is where we have to go. Now, why is a metropolitan region considered to be like a complex adaptive system? Those of you who probably realize that most of this was developed in physics and chemistry and other fields like that. It was based on atoms bouncing around and simulations that moved them around random ways and found patterns in them. So, but we feel there's a parallel here, that metropolitan systems are like open systems. That means they're able to take in input from the outside and also create export to the outside. But they're also at the edge of chaos, which is very, very important, which means that it's possible to adapt. You can't adapt if you're completely static, like the Chris Dollar thing, and you also can't adapt if you're completely chaotic. But we believe that metropolitan regions are right there, you know, some stability, some patterns, but also a lot of turmoil around the edges. Now, they also are like complex adaptive systems in that many agents act independently at using local information and heuristics. In other words, these are like the molecules bouncing around, doing their thing. They have certain rules that they follow, but also agents have their own heuristics. They base their decisions on what their rules of thumb are and on what they can see in their immediate vicinity. So what happens, of course, as a result of this is that you have, can everybody hear me, by the way? Yeah, good. Okay. You result in a very nonlinear internal dynamic system. Now, this whole model just says, you know, forget multiple regression or any sort of regression, because it just doesn't predict anything, because we're talking about a system where everything's interacting and so everything's nonlinear. I'm sorry if I've offended any professor that teaches that, but you have.
We'll get by.
Okay. Yes, nonlinear could work. Constant change. What it means is that this is every time something changes, then something else has to change. They're all interconnected. So I think of networks as being like the brains of a region, because they link people and organizations, and with dialogue at the different nodes in the network, information and feedback can flow through that and encourage adaptation. In other words, you learn that what you did last week or whatever really resulted in something different, or you find out that somebody else is doing something that would be probably better for your city or better for your agency, and so you can adapt. Now, this, to me, I would say, I don't know what you think it looks like. To me, it looks like a schematic of a metropolitan region. It happens to be the folded three-dimensional structure of cytochrome C. Now, don't ask me what that is. I didn't look it up, I'm afraid. But I was struck by this, which comes from John Casty's book on would-be worlds, and simulation is changing the frontiers of science. So there's what I guess that I meant with that diagram is to show that there's this kind of, there's a word which escapes me right now, but where there's this sort of parallel structure in the social world as well as in the physics world or the natural science world. So now we get to our definition, our way of thinking about sustainability, which may or may not be the same as some of you. We look at this as not an end state, that this is a sustainable region. It's a moving state. It has to be a moving state. And a sustainable region has diverse agents and diverse activities, just like an ecological system has to have diversity in it, and it has to have different kinds of things going on in it, so that when something happens, they've got choices. It just doesn't have to mean that, you know, some of you know about the salmon that we've been farming. They're all the same genetic group, and they're not going to be sustainable if anything happens to that genetic group, and if there may be no other salmon to replace them. So also in this system, the agents share heuristics if it's a sustainable region. That means they tend to have certain ideas about what you do if you encounter certain kinds of problems or something happens. You have a shared heuristic. Also in the sustainable region, the different agents, and by that I mean people, organizations, city governments, any of these, they're able to seize opportunities. They don't just have to do things the same way they always did them, which of course is hard to find people that feel they can do things differently, but that's what you have to have. And as a whole, if you have this, you have a system. And again, I want you to encourage you to think about this as in a systems model. The systems experiments and learns. So then it can change. It can adapt. Adapt and transform. Could even become something different. You know, like if the economy changes, then they can say, okay, well, we can't do automobiles anymore. We need to do high tech or something. And they're able to transform if they're a sufficiently sustainable region. And ultimately then be resilient in the face of challenges like recessions and the like. Or other things, huge influxes of people with different demographics and so forth. Okay, so this is the Collaborative Regional Initiatives program. Now this is James Irvine. James Irvine contributed funds to a whole series of these civic entrepreneur networks around the state. As you can see, there were quite a few in Los Angeles, but none of them quite as interesting as the ones we chose. I'm sorry to say I haven't got one of those. Here's what they are. They're voluntary groups. They involve civic leaders. They were spontaneously developed. Nobody told them to develop. The business is often motivated to do this because they're the ones that are most affected by change, but that doesn't mean they exclude social equity or environmental groups or other things, because they realize they have to work together with these folks. They focus on building sustainable regions, and a lot of them did things that government wasn't doing. They found things that weren't being done that they felt needed to be done. Now, these CRIs are basically network structures, very much like what we were talking about. Autonomous players, they can do what they want. Nobody tells them. They're not controlled in a hierarchical way. And basically what they are, and why I say they're like the brains of a region, they represent distributed intelligence throughout the region and act in self-organizing ways. And, you know, we'd make the case that you cannot centrally guide a region, even if you could come up with a governing structure. I think it would be ridiculous. And because then they would just come up with a bunch of rules, which would be good maybe for a half an hour, and then they would be no longer any good. So you really, we would argue, this is that what you need to do to make a region sustainable or to govern a region is to rely on networks where a lot of local knowledge can be used. Now, what we did in trying to figure out how to build some theory about what makes for a network that can produce can contribute to a sustainable region. They're just a piece of the picture. So we came up with 8 themes on which to compare the CRIs. We actually studied only 4 in depth. So first of all, does the CRI adapt to its regional context? Does it has to be, we said, related to the strengths and weaknesses and so forth of the region, and fulfilling something needed in the region. It needs to have a good theory of change. Now, this is really important. How many of you ever think about a theory of change? How many of you have read David, help me. Schoen and Ardress and Schoen, about theories in use and so forth. So you need to have a theory of change that actually works. Like if I do this, then that will happen. Okay. Amazingly, most of these players hadn't even thought about that, although they had tacit theories of change that we looked at. Then the role of research. If information is really important in feedback, you need to do research, we said. Leadership. What kind of leadership do these need? It's not going to be able to be the big boss. So what is it going to be like? Network structure. The structure of the network can make it more effective or less effective. And this was the difference between our studies, the groups we studied. It needs a range of activities. And then we also looked at the outcomes that could be attributed to each one of these. And then we also looked at the transition and evolution. Some of them were able to transition from one leader to another or evolve in response to changes. I mean, these are like 20-year periods, and there were changes. Okay, so first one we studied the longest lasting ones and the ones that had most outcomes at the time. And this, we did our study in 2004, 2003. Okay, the Sierra Business Council. Now the Sierra was not thought of as a region at this time. The purpose of this was to make business value in the environment. It was a woman named Lucy Blake who actually won a MacArthur Genius Award along with a whole bunch of others for her work at the Sierra Business Council. She basically she's an environmentalist from Southern California who had worked down here, and she wanted to help save the Sierra. And her idea was, at this time, you know, extractive industries were dying out, tourists and second home developments were occurring, and there was big fights. You know, we want to go back to our extractive industry. So her idea was, if you could convince business people that the environment was part of their business, that maybe you could preserve the Sierra better. She organized this around dialogue and research. Research was central. Every piece of research was discussed by large groups of people, and in various workshops. They had annual conferences which brought people from all over that 400-mile zone of the Sierra. So they produced a number of things, including a habitat protection program, working landscapes program, and a new conservancy. Now, joint venture Silicon Valley, as you can see this map, David told me not to say this, but I have to say, when I first came to California, everybody was talking Silicon Valley, and I kept looking on the map to find this Silicon Valley, and you know, it's not on the map. Finally dawned on me what it was, but I still didn't know what the area is. But anyway, it's basically where the high-tech industries is. It's only really 50 miles long or something like that, but it now kind of goes to the East Bay as well as the peninsula. The purpose of this started during a period of a recession when the high-tech economy is doing poorly. So it was a bunch of high-level business, government, education, community leaders got together and said, what can we do? And what they did was figure out what some of the problems were out there that were interfering with their economy. And then they used the venture capital model. That was the familiar model up there, which is basically, okay, we'll give you some seed money, and if you can make a go of it and raise some more money, fine. If you don't get anywhere within a year or two, we're abolishing you, okay? I should say this CRI is more like a complex adaptive system than any of the others. This is absolutely the textbook version. So they produced an indicator report like Business Council did. They did various initiatives. I'll talk a little bit about the Smart Valley Initiative, kind of bringing high-tech people together with local governments to streamline permitting. The San Diego Dialogue. Now this one grew out of a business network that was part of the extension program at UC San Diego. And this one was thought of somewhat differently. The idea was to pull together regional leaders, established leaders, and then basically to have the university people do research and find out, you know, what would be ways to go. And then the next part of their theory of change was basically, well, they defined problems with the members. The members said these are important. And then their theory of change was that these members would go out and do political advocacy and get the things done because these were powerful people. But being part of a university, they couldn't do any of that themselves. But they did accomplish certain things, which I'll also talk a little bit more about. But basically, one main thing they discovered was that San Diego really is a cross-border region. And they hadn't really thought about that before. So they brought in Mexican members and did a bunch of things like that. Now, the Bay Area Alliance for Sustainable Communities in my neighborhood, this was different also because it was inspired by the President's Council for Sustainable Development. Some of you might remember Al Gore's program. That's what it was. Oops. And what it was organized with a sort of central core of 5 people representing the 3 E's and government, and one more, I can't, it was weird. But anyway, and then then they had caucuses. Each group member of the steering committee related to a caucus of like-minded folks, and then they would get the information from them and bring it back to the steering committee, and they had to try to reach a consensus in the steering committee. And then this basically focused on smart growth. That was the whole idea. That was their idea of what sustainability was, that it should be compact patterns of growth, and I'm sure all of you have heard all that stuff. And they produced certain products. But most of these products actually, except for the Social Equity Caucus, were paper products in some way. They did get some investments in neighborhoods, but those were controversial. So let's just look at these in terms of their fit to the region. How did these fit the regions? Okay, okay. The Sierra Business Council recognized that the strengths were natural beauty, tourism, recreation, and weaknesses were failures to recognize interdependence of the economy and environment, lack of regional institutions. They had no regional, no MPO, nothing like that. And what they did was to build trust and so forth, and networks across this vast region, and people could learn from each other. Now, joint venture was recognized the strengths of the high-tech networks, the innovativeness, and the weaknesses was that there was no sense of a region, no sense that we are all in this together, that we need to strengthen the region together. And it had very flexible organization based on the way industry is organized in Silicon Valley. And that's the El Camino Real project, where they're basically collaborating across dozens of cities to improve the main street of Silicon Valley. The San Diego Dialogue had a good fit to the region also because I'm told it has a small town kind of feel, and it already had networked elites, and the major, and UC San Diego already had a network of business leaders. The weakness of that region turned out to be that they really hadn't recognized that it was a cross-border region. So they worked within that framework. The Bay Area Alliance had a fit to the region because Bay Area is full of advocacy groups. It's like dominated by advocacy groups. I did a little analysis one time about the major industry of Oakland was nonprofit groups. And there was a lot of civic-minded business leaders there too. And there were a lot of conflicts, however, lack of consensus. But what they did was to improve civil dialogue there. Now, we came to the conclusion after analyzing our 4 in-depth case studies that we did of each of these, was that Sierra Business Council and the joint venture were the most effective by a lot of the 2. So this gave us a way to start saying, okay, kind of what works, what doesn't work. How we knew what our criteria were for saying there was more effective was they both had significant demonstrable results. They both built regional knowledge and a sense of the region, that it has an identity. They both created enduring networks. They're still in place today. Or like networks, they've evolved, and some version of them is still in place today. They did innovative things that hadn't been done in the region before. And they adapted. There were changes during that time, and they were able to change what they did over time in response to feedback from what they had done before. Both of these clearly contributed to regional sustainability, and I'll give you examples a little bit later. And they're still active today. Okay, why we thought the other 2 were less effective? Both of them did contribute to regional identity and cooperation. That seems to be one thing they really can do. And both did create some new networks that hadn't been there before, but they had fewer enduring outcomes and smaller, more limited networks, as well as less public recognition. So it wasn't clear, you know, if anybody even really understood what they were doing. And both of them are gone. Okay, so now let me just look for a few minutes at the theories of change and how, because this is part of their success or failure. SBC thought you needed dialogue, you needed research, and you needed collaboration in order to make change. Joint venture thought, you know, venture capital worked in the region. It should work for what we're trying to do. The San Diego Dialogue said, well, we educate the elites, and they'll do it. That was their theory of change. And the Bay Area Alliance idea was, we get together all these interest groups and then create a coalition, and they'll go off and lobby and sit on the doorstep of Sacramento and make change. Okay, the theory of change is really critical, but it has to be realistic, it has to be explicit. If it's not explicit, then the members of your network can't use it as they do things. But it's also not transferable. You can't say, oh, you know, venture capital is a great model, and then try to use it, you know, in Fresno. You know, it has to be fitted to the time and place. Now, research, I think, was one that 3 out of the 4 really got it, that research was important, and used research as a cornerstone of their work. The Sierra Business Council basically drove their vision. They did an indicator report, a wealth index, and they figured out, you know, kind of where the Sierra was going, and drove their vision for everybody, and made sure everybody understood all those indicators and talked about them. JVSV used research in a somewhat different way to say, okay, we're going to figure out what we need to do, and then we're going to do research to help us solve that problem. And they used consultants to do that, but they were very well-respected consultants throughout the region. The San Diego Dialogue thought, well, we'll build intellectual capital among our elites, and then they'll do it. And then the Bay Area Alliance, they figured they already knew what to do and how to do it. They didn't do any research, and I would say that's despite people like myself and John Landis offering to help them. No research. This is a stakeholder group, which isn't how stakeholder groups really work. With real stakeholder groups, they do demand research, but that's a whole other story. So research, we feel, is critical to sustainability, but it has to be produced in a transparent way, and it has to be reviewed by the stakeholders. This we found in many other studies of that we've done. It has to be perceived as unbiased. You can't say, okay, here's our research and here's what we want you to do. That's just like a recipe for saying it's bullshit, your research. So it has to involve policy, it has to involve dialogue and shared meaning if it's actually going to motivate anybody to do anything. They have to actually buy into it and believe it and understand it. Here's a quote from Ben Franklin: "Tell me and I will forget. Teach me and I will remember. Involve me and I will learn." That's really the philosophy you need to have if you want research to be used. Leadership. What kind of leadership do you have? Okay, the Business Council had the disciple model. That is, Lucy Blake found a few people, inner circle, talked to them, got on the same page, and then each of them went off and got further disciples in their process. JVSV was more like enabling and facilitative. They said, okay, you want to solve this problem, we'll help facilitate it, we'll give you a little bit of money, we'll encourage you to go do it, and then you can come back later and tell us how it went. They actually asked for performance measurement to help figure that out. The Sierra San Diego Dialogue was all about personal connections. Chuck Nathanson, who was the executive director, he worked with everybody, had a personal connection with everybody. Although they didn't necessarily have connections with each other, he did it. And that was their that model. And as I said about the Bay Area Alliance, come up with a vision, build a coalition, and lobby. Now, in a successful process, leaders build more leaders. Leaders do not control, but convene, inspire, and support. They embrace challenges and encourage innovation. And we can see that because both of the successful places, CRIs, have made mistakes about the person they hired to replace their founding leader. They both overcame those and got rid of that person fairly quickly, and then they both drew on leaders they had created during the course of their work. So now they're both run by people who have been involved in over a long period of time. So they built leadership. So now let me just move to the idea that each CRI is a network. And what does that mean? This is some area where we really feel like we need to do much more work, but we began this thinking about what kind of a network works. So first of all, we say diverse participants. We're back to that same point. You need diverse participants. You don't get the innovation. You don't get the spread. Connectivity. There need to be opportunities for these people to work together, talk together, go to conferences, whatever. You need to create that connectivity. Now, this one I think is very important. It needs both strong and weak ties. So what we would find is that the board or the inner circle would have kind of strong ties. But then in a successful one, they would be connected out into the community in various ways. And those weak ties are very important for diffusing the ideas and making sure that the heuristics go further than just your inner circle. And flexibility, back to that. Basically, the network has to be able to change its structure if it's needed. So this is just a schematic of the different diagrams, but if you can, if you can see the Sierra Business Council was this distributed system with, I don't like this kind of a mouse. I can't move it the way I want to. This is the central person. That was Lucy Blake. And here's her board. And then this is somebody in the community. These are her inner circle, these red. And these are people in the community. So it was kind of spreading out this way, spreading out that way. And again, joint venture Silicon Valley, there's the executive person. And these are board members here, each one associated with a different working group. So each one has kind of got its own network out into the community. Whereas these two are notably different. This is a much more closed system, San Diego Dialogue, with this inner circle and then the outer circle, which wasn't even connected to the inner circle except through Nathanson. So it really was quite a static kind of network. The same thing with the Bay Area Alliance. This is their inner circle committee, and this is these are their caucuses out here, some of them having relationships with the community, but that wasn't really a direct part of their network, so that the board didn't relate to those people in the community. And so it was quite, in some ways, quite a closed system. So here's some of the features of a network that we feel are important. We're almost finished, hopefully giving Lisa time to say what she wants to say. Allows a good network structure, positive network structure allows information to flow among participants and from the environment. It has nodes and dialogues where learning can occur. It has diversity, because you need that for innovation, and weak ties extend the network and build capacity, and flexibility allows the networks to adapt. So here are some activities for, if you want to have sustainability, you need a variety of activities, you need experimentation, you need feedback through networks, adaptations and adjustments, and termination of failing efforts, which is something the joint venture did perfectly, and SBC did to some degree. And mistakes are okay, not like in the bureaucracy. You make them and you change them right away, not the philosophy we have in government. Tangible outcomes, the Sentry program created a cross-border fast track Placer legacy preserved land, habitat, watersheds, and a place that was getting very developed very quickly. Smart permitting in Silicon Valley enhanced development and reduced government expenditures. The intangible outcomes they pretty much all had were a new sense of regional identity and shared knowledge, and in some cases new heuristics for action and linkages among diverse players and habits of exploration. Wouldn't this be a good idea? Let's try this type of thing. And ultimately, I would say, increased regional civic capacity as an overview kind of thing. So now, just a few words about transition and evolution, and I'll stop. Change is going to be constant in these regions, as I said. The economies will rise, fall, evolve. It's just normal. It's what you have to assume. Demographic patterns are going to alter, especially in California. Leaders are going to leave. Participants will move on. Valued activities may no longer be needed. Problems will be resolved, and new ones emerge. Now, this is stuff that bureaucracy isn't very good at. Our problem is resolved. No, we're going to go out of business, right? But that's what networks are able to do. And so, but networks themselves have to keep adapting continuously. So that's a last word here. This is attributed to Albert Einstein. The world today has problems that cannot be solved by thinking the way we thought when we created them. So let me just leave you with that. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I introduce our discussant, let me mention a housekeeping matter. We do have sign-in sheets that are circulating. So if any of you know where they are, if you could pass them down, and Bianca Schulaker, Bianca, stand up so that we can see you. We'll collect those. So be sure that you do sign in somewhere. There is one way in the back. And so our discussant, following the usual tradition in this seminar series, will now have one of our own discuss this. Let me introduce Lisa Schweitzer. And before this talk, Professor Judith Innes mentioned that she knew Lisa before she met her, that her reputation had preceded her. And that's the best marker for success in what we do in the university. And I've uncovered many instances where people have known and thought very highly of Lisa's work, and was still still early on in her career. I know when I told one of my former students that I was going to accept this job, the first thing he said is, "Well, you have that very excellent environmental justice scholar, Lisa Schweitzer." And he was so impressed by this place because of the work that Lisa has done. So she's going to go on longer now.
Known to most of you as your planning theory instructor. So everybody looks smart because we've got a guest here.
So let me give the floor to Lisa Schweitzer.
All right.
Lisa, thank you.
Give her a round of applause. Well, how do you know that Professor Innes was at my very, very first sort of academic presentation ever? It was TRB 100 years ago. It was 100 years ago at TRB. It was some of your early work on transportation and NPOs. Oh, yeah. And my very first presentation was sort of on, I don't even remember what it was on. It was probably bad, but you were very nice. Yeah, no, it was terrible. Oh well, you learn to live with these things. So let's talk a little bit for the students here about sort of positioning this work in the larger body of deliberative theory, where Professor Innes's contributions are so well known. I mean, basically, we think about deliberative theory as being this universe where those of us who are interested in planning or in governance, right, are capable of looking at a process or a reflexive process that emanates from usually conflict, right, usually some form of conflict. And what emerges from there is a deliberative dialogue that allows us to enlighten the differences in values, the differences in perceptions and ideas, the differences in priorities, or just basic information, right, that helps us gather more information about the conflict or the set of decisions that we need to make, right? That's the universe of deliberative theory. And the sort of crucial role that communication plays in deliberation and governance by virtue of creating the possibilities for intersubjective understanding and, some of us hope, regard. Right? This becomes a transformative dialogue by which the different parts or the different participants in the conflict can really begin to understand the positionality and understandings of the others. Right? And that this work on network formation and use and functioning is an outgrowth of that. We can see that as an outgrowth of that, being able to understand why networks form and how these networks can foster, right, that information exchange and gathering function that comes as a part of deliberation about public issues or about public conflicts. So moving out of the contextualization and into some of the questioning and critique that we want to bring, because this is an academic seminar, and it wouldn't be me if I weren't sort of confusing the issue for all of my students. You know, you look at this and you want to ask some questions, and since I don't have the chapters of the book yet, I can't claim that I necessarily am making an informed critique, but I'm going to try anyway. And one is that you have here a set of networks that are sort of a mix of institutions and individuals, right? They're organizations, groups, and individuals. And when you do look at the network literature, you realize that individuals and organizations join networks for a whole assorted set of reasons, some of which are very pro-social, and some of which are very self-interested, right? And when you know, sometimes you do this because, ooh, you know, somebody important is part of that network. I think one of the reasons why I was giving a presentation at TRB way back in the day is that Judith Innes was going to be on my panel, right? She was important. And so that was very much a self-interested step. And that those kinds of prestige-seeking or status-seeking behaviors can be sometimes positive and sometimes negative in the formation of, in trying to address conflicts, right, and trying to deal with resolutions. And so maybe we would be able to understand a little bit more about what's going on with these particular cases if we in the audience understood a little bit more about the institutional actors and the individual actors and how they're interacting and what sort of prompted them to join. Second question sort of comes from, you know, the generic critiques of the research on collaboration more generally. And that was when you look at these sorts of voluntary ad hoc networks, there's not necessarily anything about them that forces or subverts, right, existing power relationships. Now we may be able to talk about this a little bit in such a way that we might create a transformative dialogue, right, where, you know, a number of the networks that we looked at here in particular were in elite networks. And they reinforce the capacity of elites to sort of have an impact on public agency. But that doesn't really, and this may be one of the reasons why the advocacy network that you were looking at didn't necessarily carry forward in the way that some of the other ones did, is that we know, right, that those folks don't have the power that the elite networks do, right? And so with that kind of critique in mind, we have to ask ourselves a question: what is the possibility for radical or emancipatory planning within this network idea, right? If everybody has to be voluntarily joining things, one of the things we know about it is when people voluntarily join things, they have the tendency to be more homogeneous, ideologically, right, than when people are forced to collaborate, and we know that forced collaboration also has its own problems. But that if we are doing this in such a way that we're not really confronting power inequalities across these groups, how is this a mechanism for social inclusion and planning, right? How does this formulate something where we might actually be more inclusive rather than sort of just reinforcing the existing elite power networks that run our policy and our planning in cities? And then finally, if they are so changeable, right? Did I say finally before? I really mean finally this time. I promise, right? Finally. I finally mean finally. If these networks are so ad hoc and mutating, what does that mean for democratic accountability? Right? For those of us who want to go back and sort of say, we did what we said we were going to do. We did what we promised community X we were going to do. Right? If they sort of create and form and change and adapt, and you don't necessarily know that you're going to have the same actors 5 years from now that you have now. And with that, I will sit down. Everybody, I mean it, look smart.
Okay, well, let me try to address this. This is great, Lisa, because I'm supposed to give a talk about justice and networks. And you're giving me all the topics I need to give that talk. So thank you. Let me just say about the institutions and people that are in these networks and why did they join and how did that work. they're very different. So for the Sierra Business Council, these were just small businesses. Timber industry didn't join. Eventually, maybe the ski industry kind of participated, but these were small businesses. These were the local politicians and local people. In the San Diego Dialogue, that was a whole different thing. These were elites, and they were not interested in having anything to do with the community. It wasn't anything to do with social justice at all, except insofar as they needed the cross-border trade, and that was going to be part of it. The joint venture was a bigger mix, but in the beginning they had the big high-tech industries, the famous, owners of the great companies were there, but at some point those people retired, and the new people who took over high-tech industries were these young whiz kids who were not interested in the community. They weren't going to be there. They were the dot-com boom people. And so they had to change. As a result of that, they had to get more community people in. But there was a huge resistance to that because these big business types said, we can't work with these people. We don't want anything to do with them. They just go blah, blah, blah all the time. We're not going to sit there and listen to it. Ditto in the Bay Area Alliance case, the people where there was something called the Community Capital Investment Initiative, which didn't really work, in great part because the people who were doing the investing didn't want to have anything to do with the people who were going to be evaluating whether these were really community capital investments. So there was this huge firewall between them. They never actually talked to each other. No face-to-face. Although the good thing about the Bay Area Alliance, they had a social equity group in there. They raised money for them, and that's one of the lasting legacies of the Bay Area Alliance is something called the Social Equity Caucus, still exists. It's kind of an umbrella organization for lots of little social justice organizations. So it goes various ways in each of these cases. Did it reinforce the capacity of the elite? Now, we spent a lot of time at the beginning trying to figure out whether this was the same as an urban regime, except at the regional scale. And really what we concluded was that it's broader than the urban regime, which might be just all the business people, more transparent, although not necessarily totally transparent, like the Bay Area Alliance people, their meetings were private. The others were one-on-one, so you didn't always see that. In San Diego Dialogue, they were private, but still, they were more diverse than what we had before. Like Carl Anthony, who was the first person in the Bay Area Alliance one, he said, at least I got to be at the table. I made them listen to me. And maybe they didn't give me everything I want, but this is a big step. So there was some of that going on. Some more people involved in these things than before, more diverse than it was, but not diverse enough. Although there's some down here that are labor run, and in the Salinas Valley, there's one that's very much about social justice and all that kind of thing. Power differences, how do you deal with those? And so what your question was, how can we deal with the power differences in the networks or outside and inside?
Both.
Okay.
You're emeritus after all.
That's true. I don't have to prove anything. My students always gave me grief about this because they feel like you can't deal with power differences in stakeholder groups, which is totally untrue because stakeholder groups understand that some people are more powerful. That's just part of the game, but they also know that nobody would come to that place unless they needed something. So there's some modification of that, and some of these people are able to create different kinds of opportunities than would have been there before, that are more inclusionary and so on. So that's a really hard question, but it's worth paying attention to, but it's different from how we did it before. And the last thing, the democratic accountability, that's basically the unanswerable question for collaborative processes for so many. And we're working on that, but we don't really have a good answer for that because, except to say that these networks may be more diverse and more inclusionary than the way decisions would be made without them. But as for, they don't work in the sense of okay, you have to do this, let's see if you did it, and we'll evaluate you later and punish you if you didn't. They have to make mistakes, and there's a whole bunch of different kind of dynamics in all this. So I think we have to redefine democracy. Good luck with that. Okay, is there time for some questions?
Yes.
Comments, criticisms? Yes?
I'm from South Korea, and I know for a fact that our government was trying to replicate Silicon Valley for decades. And I know some of them were successful, some of them are not. So my question is, so with these 8 qualities or attributes of CRI that you explained, do you think these qualities are transferable to other countries or other contexts with different culture and different ethnicity?
I would hope so. And by the way, this is going to be a paper that hopefully is going to be published in Planning Theory and Practice. It's under review there now, so hopefully you'll be able to check it out in that journal in another year or something. But we tried to come up with these kind of concepts that could cross cultures, but we haven't tested it. But I know that in Korea they're very interested in collaborative processes, and I've been there a couple times to talk about these things. So it's just that everything has to be adapted to the time and place. And what that adaptation is, only the people in that place are going to know to do it. But if you can use some of the concepts, that's how we tried to write our book, so that it had concepts in it, and we emphasize that they have to be different for every place, but these are some concepts to help you think about how to do it. That was our idea anyway. Other? Dowell.
So you have a lot of diversity across these different groups, maybe even more so than between here and South Korea. Just between the groups, the Bay Area, the Oakland people and the San Diego people are a world apart.
Absolutely.
But I kind of lost track, though, I think probably from the very beginning, as to what are these regional groups producing? Are they producing support for political candidates? Are they producing decisions about taxing and spending? How do they relate to the
They're
elected
not
officials?
decision makers. They're not decision makers.
So what do they produce?
And so we have a long list of kind of outcomes, which I talked about a little bit at the end there. They don't produce the same thing a bureaucracy would produce, and they don't make decisions. They can't make decisions. They are not positioned to make decisions. But what they do produce, we think, is a much more capable region, and in which the players within it can make much more sensible decisions, especially the elites who are part of these networks. So each one is just making a little dent here, a little dent there. They all had some, physical outcomes. Like there's this border crossing that is for regular commuters in the San Diego Tijuana border. They've now replicated this across the southern border with Mexico, and well as created some up in Canada. So there's a specific thing they did, but it was other people that produced that. It was actually somebody who was part of the network who got together with the state attorney or the person for San Diego County, I don't know, and they brought this to the Congress and so forth. So these are things that where the stuff sort of trickles through, and again, the Bay Area Alliance, for all its problems, actually created this footprint workshop, which has now started to be used in Sacramento, and then the people in Sacramento thought this is a great thing. This is for figuring out where development ought to go, patterns of development.
You mean the blueprint?
The blueprint. So it became the blueprint for the blueprint, and it kind of traced through there. So a lot of this is about ideas making their way through the system. Joint Venture Silicon Valley has more concrete things than that. I mean, they had actually changed the laws in Silicon Valley so that instead of having 400 exceptions to the state building code across the valley, they ended up with 11. And then they were able to streamline development permits and so forth at the time it was 90,000 developments during that period. So things like that they can do, but they don't, a lot of times, however, and part of your question was, what's the relationship to government? Each one of these had a somewhat different relationship. So the Bay Area Alliance included government, a person from ABAG, the COG, was on their central committee. And then they went to local government afterwards to lobby for their smart growth. But they didn't have local government involved in it, which is one of the reasons I think they didn't succeed. Whereas the Sierra Business Council, they kind of worked with people they trained people. They had something called the Sierra Leadership Seminar, which they taught people how to do collaboration. They taught them about the region and so forth. And some of those people were government folks, like in Placer County. So Placer County people said, hey, we want to do this. Come and help us. So Sierra Business Council very quietly behind the scenes helped the people in Placer County to come up with this thing. They were very conservative, but they decided to go ahead with it. And Sierra Business Council didn't take any credit for it or anything. So there's a variety of ways in which they work. Government may be part of the networks. They also may be outside, but it doesn't work so well when they're outside. Yeah, true.
Going back to your sort of opening discussion of the sort of analog of this complicated molecular atomic structure of this thing, and that's what it looks like. I agree. But I was trying to sort of fit in your, this notion of the self-organizing system. So each of these groups, are you sort of seeing them as a self-organizing, or they collectively are self-organizing? And this sort of goes back to Dal's point. So what are the other kinds of linkages and networks and effects influence are making to the existing institutional systems and structures? Are they filling some gaps? Are they filling some, making some new connection, or have some new adaptation within the existing institutional structure?
Well, that's a great question, but I don't know. David, could you answer that? My view of it was just that they've created some new network structures. I haven't studied the existing network structures in the region. In fact, it only came to us after we started doing this study that was how we need to look at it. And I think people need to look at the network structures throughout the region that already exist and see how they work. Do you have any better answer?
There was government involved in this, and they would go back and they had other networks that they were engaged in. So I was part of that.
So there are other agents?
Yeah, even at the state level, because they belong to state associations, and there was a discussion brought at the state level through people who were participating. If you're familiar with complexity theory and the concept of fractals, going to your question about so you've got a complex pattern, you have a complex system within these networks, and it is replicated or is replicated by the greater, region at a higher level, it's the same pattern.
And the research we did for many years on different water projects in Northern California, shows that the networks that were created in the first one, the San Francisco Estuary Project, then sort of migrated into the next one, the Sacramento Water Forum, and migrated again into the CalFed process, and now have migrated into the Delta Vision process, the Delta management process. Yeah, and it's also those weak ties and strong ties that made a difference too, to all of these things. So it's a great question, and I hope some of you will do some research on what Frida asked about. Hilda.
I wonder whether maybe we can discuss a little bit the implications of this work for urban planning, both the institutional planning as well as practices like neighborhood planning.
That's where I'm just trying to get to now. I'm trying to do this article for planning theory and practice because they want both practice results and theory results. And so for the simplistic answer to that is, first of all, we need to have some people do more research on networks in planning activities related to planning, so that we have something we can teach our students about, and we need to not tell them that they are going to go work in a bureaucracy and do what they're told, because that is not that isn't working anyway, but really we need to open up the minds of our students to the idea that they'll be out there winging it a lot of the time. I mean, they do anyway, but they don't want to admit it, you know. So how can we help them learn to wing it, learn to get the heuristics that will work, learn to build networks themselves, learn to participate in them? I think planning, a lot more planning could get done if planners were able to sponsor networks, or I guess they really would have to be enabling networks the way the joint venture is.
I was going to point out that Seattle had a very lengthy neighborhood planning process during the late 90s. And during
I don't know
that
if they
time-
can hear you back.
Oh, Seattle engaged in a neighborhood planning process in the late 1990s to support its sustainable Seattle plan. And basically what they did was actually enable the self-organization of neighborhood groups. You've probably heard this case.
Yes.
Right.
I went and talked to them, and they were wonderful.
Yeah.
The most enabled citizenry that I have ever seen. 200 people came to talk about social indicators.
Exactly, and so I think that's a great example. That's a great example of how some of your ideas really, can be implemented.
Yeah, I would say also that part of this is to try to recognize that these networks are all about learning. And you really have to find ways to help the public learn, but not by getting up there and educating them, which is what most planners think. I mean, I personally believe that the way we do public participation in planning is completely screwed up. And it's worse than nothing for the most part. So that really what you need is to have a way that people can feel empowered themselves, and you need to have research that they're going to trust and believe. So that's a whole process in itself, which is, I mean, the Sierra Business Council was marvelous at that, getting people to understand and trust the research so they could act on it. So those are some of the things. So
Hi, Dr. Innes. My name is Bradley Henning. I'm a Master of Planning student. And I was wondering, are you familiar with any CPI models that are being applied to the development of high-speed rail? And if so, what's their form?
I'm not familiar with any. I think this is like barreling through, but David, are you?
This is a top-down planning.
I think it is. David, you
Well, no, their idea was to hire PR firms to sell the
It's a social market.
Yeah.
social market.
Yeah. That's too much, in my opinion, what is done in planning agencies anyway today.
Well, can we talk about this within the light of his question, which is one of the things that I don't necessarily know that the structures of the network internally are replicated outside. There are certainly network structures for the participants outside the sort of learning network that you're talking about. But the structure of those networks, right, do require attention and accountability between your loyalties to this group and your loyalties to the agency, which gets straight to Brad's question about sort of retaining, right, high-speed rail's public face. Right, and this is probably something you might want to be thinking about, because you do have greater institutional accountabilities than just one instance of collaboration.
Absolutely. There's a great book, is it Thompson's book on matrix organization? Where basically, matrix organization is a way where you belonging to at least two different groups, and you get together with other people from other groups. They did the same thing in CalFed, where the people had divided loyalties at one level, so they constantly have to struggle and juggle between what the Department of Water Resources wants them to do and what they think is the right thing to do about the groundwater problem or whatever it is. So, but that's how you get creativity if you do that, if people can stand it. So it may be also another model to tell our students about, that your job, I mean, we have a professional ethics, we have we're supposed to not just do what the boss tells us. We're supposed to do what we believe is right, and that doesn't mean just like impose our opinion on everybody else, but to have a certain ethical principle. And if somebody, I mean, I got really mad at the planning director in my town when she went ahead and allowed a development to be passed by the city council without an environmental impact assessment. And in the middle of the summer when nobody was there to complain. But we brought it all the way to the Supreme Court. And she lost, or the city lost, and now it's against the law for even a city council to pass, put something on the ballot without an EIR. But that's the kind of thing where you have to stand up to it. You don't just say, oh, they're my boss, they might fire me. Because how can you live with yourself if you're going to be a planner? I saw a question over here somewhere.
Question?
Back there?
I guess in terms of choosing the networks that you focused on, how did you decide upon those? Was it the level of formality or the level of influence they were able to exert? Or
It was much simpler than that. They were the ones out of the networks that were the most, had done the most, and had the most to show, because we were trying to find out if there were outcomes, and we wanted to make sure there would be some outcomes, or at least there would have been time for the outcomes. And they were also more complex. And then there were other reasons, like you always have. You know, like Anno Saxenian already knew all about joint venture, and you know, Karen Christensen's mother was in San Diego. You know, those are also reasons.
I guess along that vein, how well known are they for the population largely? You know, how many people know of their existence?
Well, that was different. Joint venture Silicon Valley is very well known. And that's partly because they have a media strategy, and because they have the San Jose Mercury News, which picked up all their releases and did it. Nobody ever heard about the Bay Area Alliance outside of it. And the Sierra Business Council, I don't think they, you know, they don't have a major paper there, but word of mouth is how things work in the Sierra anyway. So it's hard to say, but I couldn't find it. But I think they need to be known. That's an important part of all this, but it's difficult with the newspaper world as it is, and, you know, the media problems. Somebody else over here, yes?
Yeah, going back to what we were discussing before about either following the mandate of a regulatory body or even pursuing your own ethics, in that sense then, is there a role for adversarialism in these sort of collaborative institutions, where if you want to whether pursue the professional ethics of planning, is there room for you to be able to sort of put aside other interests that may be legitimate but are not conducive to the end result that you're trying to reach? Or have you seen that occur?
Okay, I'm not sure. Can you just elaborate a little more?
I guess I'm trying to say, is there room for planners in these collaborative institutions to be adversarial in trying to get the end result, which may be, in their opinion, in the greater good, or be part of the mandate of the regulatory body that they represent?
Okay, this is a big problem, in my view, with the people coming to planning school. They really think that they know better. And they may, who knows. But, you know, you're not entitled to have your opinion be the one that gets chosen, at least not, I don't believe so, or what some of your professors might have told you is the right way to do. It just, to me, the only way that's just is the way that you allow people to be part of this. And you play a big part in what they understand, but you're not manipulating them. But if you go out there like the Sierra Business Council did, get the best research you can possibly get in the region, have a bunch of workshops and talk about it, and have people say, well, this is really alarming. I didn't know we had this problem. And then, okay, let's get together and see what we could do about that problem. I think planning is destroying its potential because too many planners, and I see this in our MTC at our MPO in the Bay Area, they think they know better. They have phony kinds of public hearings to force their ideas on it. And now we've got the Tea Party in force going to every planned Bay Area meeting and getting up and saying, this is manipulated, you're just telling us what to do. And I thought, okay, you're right, Tea Party.
And you're sort of talking about a different universe of institutional leadership, right? Because it shouldn't necessarily be the case that just because you work at a particular organization, that if you have a supportive leader within that organization, that person should be capable of understanding that it's not just about social and marketing, a project we've already committed to in a major way. It's also about creating or unleashing that radical potential for getting information from the rest of the network and creating a learning process back and forth between the institution and that collaborative that you're a part of, right? That's a different form of, I'm the boss, our job is to protect the agency, our job is to look good in the newspaper. You know, this is what we're doing, instead of sort of going forward with this real commitment, right, to collaborative dialogue.
See, I think one of the things really worth watching is the delta process. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that now, but it's like all your water depends on this process and what happens in it. And they've set it up in a very loose sort of a way, you know, and I was just involved in a conference on this a couple days ago, and Phil Eisenberg, who's running it, is a very savvy politician, and you know, they can do review and assessments and various kind of things, but it's not a bureaucracy. It is not a top-down system. Has multiple players getting involved, many of whom are part of networks themselves, and we'll see how it works out, but it's a different model of how you get things done, and it's absolutely necessary for anything as complex as the Delta and anything as important as the Delta to the entire state of California. So keep an eye on that.
If there is, we have time for one last question. Yes?
Just in terms of like the kind of environmental climate in California, looking at SB 375, I know you'd mentioned the Sacramento Blueprint rolling out. I mean, do you have any suggestions for kind of making these regional networks more collaborative with the local entities so they hold them accountable? Have done some research, and obviously there's some concerns on how you can, you know, create kind of a relationship that makes it more collaborative and effective between regional and local agencies rolling out like the transportation and housing process. Do you have any suggestions for that?
That is a really good question. Personally, I despair of it, looking at what goes on in our region. I mean, these people, regional transportation agencies, they got money. They don't have to ask anybody. They just go through the motions, and that's what they're doing now with this SB 375 stuff, which is, you know, driving some people quite crazy, and perhaps rightfully so. So I think the only chance is really for networks, loose networks between these ones to do some of this. And that's, I think, what happened in the Bay Area. They created, after the Bay Area Alliance, I think this may be partly due to the Bay Area Alliance's work between government agencies. They created something called a policy committee. I guess it's a state law, right? It isn't? I thought it was required. Okay, well, whatever it is, it's a regional policy committee involving the four major regional agencies and a bunch of other people. Unfortunately, it's gotten very politicized with a bunch of politicians don't do collaboration. Don't expect them to do collaboration. If other people can do it and give them a package that works, then maybe they'll take it. But still, it's the opportunity for these people who had never talked to each other before the Bay Area Alliance to actually have meetings together, which does get you some things do come out of that. So you're talking bureaucracies that are organized this way, and you want something that's organized this way for a region. And you know, I think it just, that's the Delta process too. It's got a lot of organized agencies organized this way, but it's had a history of 20 years of cooperating around a problem. So if we could come up with a great problem they have to cooperate around in the regions, maybe.
Well, I would love to continue this, but I have to be the clock watcher. So let's have one more round of applause.